Amid the myriad emergency preparation programs, an old idea emerges, namely self-sufficiency. The ability to feed and house yourself without the support of electricity or gas. It's a radical idea, one that brings with it an appreciation of the power of nature and our place in it. According to emergency preparedness expert Kim Fournier, if you know how to create a source of energy for cooking and warmth, where to find water and sanitize it, where you can find edible food, and you know how to keep yourself dry and warm, then you can survive the aftermath of most tragedies. She points out that it's a good idea to get good at camping and keep your gear in good repair. Fournier shares insights from her career in the Canadian military on how to survive. Paramount among them is looking after one another. She says the people most likely to live following a tragic event are the ones who belong to a neighborhood that looks out for each other. Along the way, in this life of sustainability, Fournier says you'll gain insights into the impact we're all having on Mother Earth. She says self-reliance is about creating a life that has a minimal environmental impact because you have no choice. You have to source locally. And that, she points out, is what preparedness in large measure is about. We invited emergency preparedness expert Kim Fournier to join us for a conversation that matters about living a life that prepares you every day for sudden, threatening changes.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Kim Fournier, welcome.
Thank you.
You've written a book on emergency preparedness for families, 7 steps to emergency preparedness for families. Before we get into some of the elements of this book, I think that it's important to kind of start by understanding the holistic approach that you have towards emergency preparedness. You're saying don't just prepare for an emergency, prepare for living a sustainable way of life. Why is emergency preparedness through to living a sustainable lifestyle part of a continuum?
This day and age, we can't separate emergency preparedness from self-sufficiency and a sustainable way of living. The magnitude and the frequency of disasters are coming quick, and we need to be prepared for that. And the effects of those disasters on our environment, we're seeing it every day. The weather and our environment 50 years ago, if we just look back and we compare it to today and we imagine what it possibly could be like in 50 years and what our children will experience, then we need to prepare. And emergency preparedness is one of 3 phases of self-sufficiency and sustainable living, as I see it.
So what are those 3 stages?
So the first stage is emergency preparedness, and it's the starter. The second stage is an ongoing self-sufficiency, and the third stage is sustainable living. And again, it's an ongoing process, and I'll explain them. Emergency preparedness teaches us about our needs, our daily needs. What do we need for food and water and shelter? As we're preparing for, it's a short-term survival process, if you will. As you're preparing your home, your family, your health, your supplies, your food, for about 7 days, you're thinking about the long term, and it's the starter fluid, if you will, to developing a more sustainable, more self-sufficiency, and being aware of how dependent we are on external sources for that.
Well, I think that that's a big point of it too. We have become so reliant on external sources for the essentials of life that we don't think about where they come from and what it takes to make sure that we have them when they're no longer available just at the flick of a switch.
Exactly. Water, for example. If that's no longer available, where will people get water?
Right. And I guess the time to be thinking about it isn't in the moments when you need the water after there's been some kind of an event. It's in preparing long beforehand by knowing that if you need an emergency source of water, it's available to you.
Absolutely. And how to sanitize water.
I know. It seems like such... We don't think about it. I think when you and I were having discussions before this conversation, you know, you're talking about how do you sanitize water, and I have to admit that I went, how do you do that again? And I've sort of tested that question on a few other people, and they have the same perplexed look. How do I do that? And of course, the answer is simple. Mm-hmm.
Yes, boil it. Boil it for 1 minute. And it's so simple. And
1 minute, that's it.
1 minute, yeah, absolutely. And it's so simple. We've just, I mean, it's nobody's fault. It's just society moves in a certain way, and we follow the flow, and we become dependent on all these things, and we kind of forget, oh, wait a minute. And that's where we're at with society now, with the disasters coming and the carbon imprint. And I mean, it's all linked together. It's all one. When one prepares for an emergency, we start to realize what we need for water and shelter and food and so on and so forth. And as we're preparing, we realize, wow, we are so dependent on external sources. And as you're doing that, you're realizing, how could I be more self-sufficient? For example, water, and you start to learn about that. And the process goes on where you may eventually sort of extend the emergency preparedness process into rainwater harvesting, so on and so forth. And so you're no longer dependent on external resources for water. And the same goes for food.
So hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So the moment you start to think about the fact that I need water, then you start to say, well, hang on a second, how am I going to ensure that I have that source? So rainwater collection would be one for sure. And then if you start thinking, well, how am I going to purify it? Well, then what's my heat source if I don't have electricity or gas? And I don't have a wood fireplace any longer. So what am I going to do? So you start to then build in a series of different measures that help you to be appropriately prepared.
Absolutely. And it's not overnight. It's an ongoing process. We don't have to know everything about everything or have the skills. That's why we have community. We help each other out.
So how much at risk are we if we live in such a plugged-in world where we're used to like flicking on the switch and there's electricity and we turn on the gas and there's heat, our communications are instant and so on, and we have become so far removed from what are the basic processes of being able to survive. How much at risk are we, not so much just to the event itself, but in our inability to respond?
Good question. How much at risk we are? The disasters and the events are becoming more and more frequent. I believe Vancouver, we lost electricity just a couple of weeks ago.
Right, and in some areas for more than a week.
And so when we start looking as well with the fires and the drought, and we're starting to see watering restrictions in some areas, temperatures continuing to rise, and the risk is it's inevitable. It's going to happen to us slowly. You know, if we don't prepare for it, all of a sudden it's going to be here, and we won't know. We won't know what to do with that risk, and yet it is so simple to prepare. It really is.
So in your book, The 7 Steps to Emergency Preparedness for Families is a starting place. What are those 7 steps?
Well, and it focuses on the basic needs. So first of all, your documentation, right? Your important papers. So you want to make sure your affairs are in order, and you safeguard those documentation, be it an external drive, paper, and so on and so forth. The second step is to prepare a communications plan. How will you communicate with your family? And if the communications are down, electricity, the internet, the Wi-Fi is down, right?
Heaven forbid.
No longer Facebook. Oh my God, what do we do, right?
Right.
So, so your communication plan is your second step. Your third step is to develop an a shelter in place or an evacuation plan. And so emergencies will come down to one or two things. Either you will shelter where you are, or you will evacuate to a friend, some other area. And so you need to know what to bring, how to prepare your home so it's safe, that you have water and food and shelter and so on.
Well, that's also an arrangement that you're going to want to have established in advance. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a pure response, it's actually thinking about it and planning in advance. Absolutely.
Kind of like going on a trip, like a camping trip. You think, okay, we need the tents and the sleeping bags and this and that and the water and then you go. You don't just hop in the car and go.
Okay, well, a little sidebar here. How important do you think being an experienced camper will benefit you in the event that there's an emergency?
Greatly. I mean, to camp, we intentionally go to remote locations with no power, no water, and we do that and we call it a vacation. We go intentionally and we bring the kids and we have a lot of fun and we unplug and somehow we come back all relaxed. Mm-hmm. And so we learn how to sleep in the elements. We learn how to
boil
water, where to find water, what are safe places to find water. And what do you have to do? You filter, do you sanitize? You learn shelter, you learn how to just be out in nature. So to provide for all your basic needs. Mm-hmm. And then we go back home and then we plug back in and we're dependent. And so exactly, preparing for emergency is just like you planning for a camping trip.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
It's kind of a radical idea because I don't think I've ever heard it presented in such a way that if you learn to start to be able to manage yourself to 3, 4, 5 days in a campsite, even just a campsite, let alone the wilderness, you've gone a long way to making sure that you're going to be okay to get through that first initial week or so after there's been a major event. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about it. I mean, you made reference to the fact that there was the windstorm here, and it put people without power for more than a week. Well, I wonder how many of them actually were appropriately prepared, or were they now starting to scramble as they tried to get through this? Mm-hmm. Do we do a very good job of responding to these things when they happen? Like, is it a wake-up call, or do we? Because as you pointed out, they seem to be coming in wave after wave after wave. Are we becoming a little bit immune to it? Going, well, here comes the next one, but still not ensuring that we're looking after ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I think there is nowadays, because there are so many drastic disasters. I mean, this summer we saw fires and mm-hmm. just unimaginable fires devastating our forests, electricity, winds, and so on and so forth. So they're becoming so frequent. People are watching them on TV, and I feel risk perception is actually going down because of that. And people because they are becoming, they're quite large. People are feeling that it's just not doable to prepare for these things, and yet it is really, really so simple. Mm-hmm. It comes down to preparing to go camping.
Well, let's talk a little bit about you and how you got to this, philosophy, which I think really makes sense. The more that I think about it, okay, well, that's really quite simple. If I'm planning to be able to go camping, I can do that quite easily. I'm going to buy sleeping bags, I'm going to have appropriate clothing, and so on. What was it in your life that led you to this? How did you first become introduced to the idea of being able to prepare for, in essence, a mission such as emergency preparedness?
A lifelong accumulation of experience. I've spent time in the military, 25 years overseas, where you live basically under tent for 6 months sometimes, on mission, it depends. And you work as a team and you learn that, you know, the skills, the multi-dynamic effects of a team. Public health, I've worked a lot with public health and medical as well in disaster management with the province, and I realized that while as disasters are happening more and more frequent, it really is the family that is the most powerful source, and we've seen other countries where post-disaster, the community, they get together, and it's just instinctual. We help people out, and yet the family has very little tools to actually prepare them.
Right.
As far as just information, okay, where do we start? It really is easy, but you know, for someone who this is not their their profession, is really complicated. So. And it really is just, and that's why I wrote this book, to give families a tool to start. Really simple. Yeah. All hazards, you know, don't prepare for a flood and then a week later prepare for, other disasters and so on and so forth. It's really easy to have one plan, all hazards, and it covers all your bases.
You talked about, in very sort of brief, 25 years in the military. That's a lot of experience, actually. How important was it that you kept revisiting your plan, revising it, practicing, ensuring that you had the right equipment in place, and so that when you were then presented with situations, it didn't come as a surprise? How important was that?
Oh, essential. The Canadian Forces teaches you to work as a team and constantly testing, checking your gear, testing, exercising, and then once you actually deploy, you're confident. You know exactly what to do, and you're confident with your team members and the capability. There's no vulnerabilities, and you're self-sufficient because you've worked together and you've tested it and you checked. It's absolutely essential.
Third and final break. Promise. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So this would be a component of becoming a really good camper too. You want to be checking your gear before you go out. And so if you're constantly sort of doing those kinds of things and being prepared, it's not like, okay, I'm going to go store all this stuff and I'm going to stick it over there, and then if the disaster ever comes, I know that I've got this emergency kit. That's almost the wrong way of thinking, isn't it? And so then if I start to get to the point where I'm saying, okay, I'm going to develop a plan so that I can survive an individual incident, how then does that grow into the other sort of pillars of your philosophy around how we become more self-sufficient and live in a sustainable environment?
Well, I'll give you an example. Say Mrs. Smith, a little story. So Mrs. Smith is starting to prepare for emergencies, so short-term self-sufficiency, survival, if you will. And you start anywhere. So she starts with food. And so she takes a look at the food that her family consumes, their needs, and starts to realize where she gets this food and realize, oh my, why am I buying fish, when I live on the West Coast from Thailand, or where it's available all local, or even just know how to fish themselves. So she looks at her food source, her needs, her sources, and then she starts to prepare for emergency. So she's good. She has supplies for a week or so. And then she starts to realize how dependent she is on external sources. Not only that, but all the packaging and all that is just not necessary. So she starts to build a garden. And here we go. That much more self-sufficiency, less dependency. less packaging, less garbage, less carbon imprint, and it just goes on, right? And this is, and she learns how to prepare food in alternate ways as well, if there's no heat source, and preserve food in different ways, and store food in different ways.
So, and in doing so, she's starting to reduce her own environmental footprint, isn't she? Now, there are going to be some people who are going to go, hang on a second here. You're suggesting that I go through a radical shift in the way that I live. But I don't get the sense that that's what you're saying. You're saying, let's start to look at how we source the things that are important to us in our lives and do it in the most sustainable and viable manner.
Yes, absolutely. Our children need that information. They need to get used to it. Take a look at bags, plastic bags, or even bottled water. These are things that we didn't have 50 years ago, 150 years ago, but they just appeared in our daily life. Bottled water, you know, people just assume that water comes in bottles, right?
Right.
And the carbon imprint is just, and here we are bottling water that we have so readily available. But we became used to that and dependent, and then it's just part of it's in our homes, you know. And now we're trying to de-link. We're trying to, because we realize how much damage and garbage, and it's not necessary. And so really looking at what our true needs are, as we do when we prepare for emergency preparedness, we realize what we have been led to believe that are our needs, and, you know, like bottled water, plastic bags and stuff like that. So,
and so this is where it trips over from emergency preparedness to being able to be, you know, self-sustaining, to living a sustainable lifestyle. The three become part of a continuum and make a better contribution to our world. It seems so interesting to look at emergency preparedness from that perspective. There's one other element that you touched on, and the fact is that if you're not prepared, you are potentially run the risk of being traumatized by the event, and preparedness reduces that trauma. You've seen this happen, have you?
Absolutely. In emergency preparedness, we also learn the mental health component. When we talk about it, we prepare for it, and we build our capabilities, and we sort of know what's going to happen and how to deal with it, we're reducing the potential for trauma. It's kind of like we don't send our children off to their first day of school without talking about it, without lunch, without shoes and a jacket. We don't do that. And yet, you know, our children are so unprepared for the events that are happening. Even our generation has trouble thinking, okay, if water doesn't come out of the tap, what do I do? Oh, right, you know, boil it. But we just forget about that. And so, and our children are even more dependent. And so we really need to plan and prepare and talk and have them participate, and it's fun. And then once they run with it, right, they love it, and they're so much more resilient, and they know what to expect, and the trauma is so much less when they are prepared, you know?
Yep. Well, this is without a doubt the most common sense approach that I've heard towards emergency preparedness, and it is not happening in isolation. It's part of a continuum that isn't about just surviving the event, but creating sustainability. Thanks.
Thank you.